Let me ask you something directly, and I want you to be honest with yourself when you hear it. Have you ever walked out of the bedroom with that quiet question lingering in your mind, wondering if what just happened was truly enough for her? Or if something was missing that you couldn't quite identify? If that thought has ever crossed your mind, even for a second, you're far from alone. Because when researchers sat down and spoke with more than 10,000 women, a clear pattern emerged. Most of them admitted there are certain things they deeply want during intimacy, things that matter more than technique or duration. Yet they rarely voice those desires openly. Not because they don't trust their partner, but because hesitation, politeness, or even uncertainty holds them back. And here's where it becomes important for you to pay attention. The majority of men never figure this out. They continue repeating the same patterns, the same approach, hoping consistency equals satisfaction, without realizing that what they're missing is not effort, but understanding. Now consider this carefully, because it may challenge what you've always assumed. What if the secret to truly memorable intimacy isn't about learning complicated techniques or extending the experience by some arbitrary measure of time, but instead about something much simpler and far more powerful? Something rooted in how the mind and body respond to connection rather than performance. Stay with me, because I'm going to walk you through this step by step, using both scientific understanding and practical insight, so you can see exactly what creates not just physical arousal, but a deeper sense of emotional safety, desire, and connection that allows a woman to fully let go in the moment. Before we go further, take a second to engage with this. If you're finding value in this kind of direct, honest conversation, make sure you've subscribed and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. There's something meaningful about knowing this conversation is reaching men across different parts of the world, all trying to improve the same area of their lives. Now, let's get into what really matters. Most men grow up believing that what women want most is novelty and technique, something exciting, something visually impressive, something that resembles what they may have seen elsewhere. But that belief doesn't hold up under real-world evidence. Clinical experience and repeated studies point in a very different direction. What women respond to most is not a new move. It is the feeling of being genuinely desired. And I understand that may sound almost too simple, almost like it can't possibly be the full answer, but stay with that idea for a moment and think about what happens internally when that feeling is present. When a woman feels truly seen, when she senses that your attention is focused on her and not divided, her body begins to respond in a measurable way. Her nervous system shifts out of tension and into relaxation. Blood flow increases where it matters. Natural responses begin to build without force. At the same time, her brain releases chemicals that are directly tied to bonding and pleasure, creating a state where physical and emotional openness happen together. That combination is what separates an average experience from one that stays with her long after it's over. Something she recalls not just physically, but emotionally, with a sense of satisfaction that feels complete. For those of you who are new to this conversation, let me briefly establish context so you understand where this perspective comes from. My name is Dr. Jocelyn Carter, and I work as a urologist focused on men's health. Over the past 5 years, I've worked closely with men dealing with performance concerns, confidence issues, and questions they often feel uncomfortable asking elsewhere. At the same time, I've had extensive conversations with women who openly share what they wish their partners understood. What I'm sharing with you now is not speculation. It comes from patterns that repeat themselves across real experiences and clinical observation. So here's how we're going to approach this. I'm going to guide you through the most common mistakes men make in the bedroom, the kind that quietly reduce connection without you even realizing it. And alongside each one, I'll show you the simple adjustment that can completely change how she experiences intimacy with you. Pay attention as we move through this, because by the time we reach the final point, you'll notice a clear shift in how all of this fits together. Let's begin with something that most men don't even recognize as an issue, and that is silence. If you think about your own behavior, you may notice that during intimate moments, there isn't much communication beyond physical interaction. Maybe a few sounds, maybe a breath here or there, but otherwise very little verbal expression. From a biological perspective, this matters more than you might expect. Women are highly responsive to auditory cues, especially when those cues carry emotion and intention. The sound of your voice, when it reflects genuine desire or approval, activates areas of her brain that are directly linked to emotional processing and arousal. Now, look at the emotional side of this. When there's silence, it doesn't feel neutral. It often feels like uncertainty. She may begin to question whether you're enjoying the moment, whether she's doing something right, or whether you're simply going through the motions. That kind of doubt pulls her attention away from the experience itself and places it into her own thoughts, which immediately reduces her ability to stay present. The adjustment here is straightforward, but it requires intention. Use your voice. It doesn't need to be complex or poetic. Even a simple, honest statement that expresses what you're feeling in that moment can completely change how she perceives the interaction. Now let's move to another pattern that tends to go unnoticed, and that is what I would describe as generic touch. Many men follow a routine without realizing it. The same sequence, the same gestures, repeated in a way that lacks specificity. From the outside, it may look like effort, but from her perspective, it can feel interchangeable, as if the actions are not uniquely connected to her. Biologically, this kind of touch doesn't engage the brain in the same way as something that feels intentional and specific. But when you combine touch with clear appreciation, something changes. When you express exactly what you like, when you make it clear that your attention is on her as an individual, her brain responds more strongly because it recognizes that she is being noticed, not just touched. Emotionally, that distinction matters. It reassures her that she is desired as she is, without comparison or expectation. So instead of moving through the same motions, anchor your actions with words that reflect what you genuinely appreciate in that moment. That connection between what you do and what you say creates a stronger, more meaningful response. Now we come to one of the most common patterns, and that is rushing the buildup. Many men approach intimacy with a goal-oriented mindset, focusing on progression rather than experience. Moving quickly from one stage to the next may feel efficient, but it doesn't align with how female arousal develops. Unlike a simple on and off switch, it functions more like a gradual increase, requiring time and consistency to reach its full potential. Physically, this means that if you move too quickly, her body may not have the time it needs to respond fully, which can lead to discomfort or a reduced experience overall. From an emotional standpoint, rushing sends a message, even if it's unintended. It can make her feel like part of a process rather than someone you are fully engaged with. The adjustment here requires patience. Slow down deliberately. Allow the buildup to become the experience itself rather than something you try to move past. When you do that, you create space for anticipation. And that anticipation is often what intensifies the entire interaction. I want you to pause here and reflect on these first few points, because they form the foundation for everything that follows. What we're uncovering is not about complexity, but about awareness, intention, and the willingness to adjust habits that may have gone unquestioned for years. We continue from where we left off, and now we move deeper into the next layer of mistakes that quietly shape how intimacy is experienced, often without men realizing it in the moment. Another important pattern to understand is the absence of feedback during intimacy. Many men assume that silence or minimal reaction is enough, or they simply focus on their own experience without considering how feedback shapes the interaction for their partner. But from a psychological standpoint, feedback is not just communication, it is reinforcement. When someone receives clear signals that what they are doing is appreciated or effective, the brain activates a reward loop that increases confidence and engagement. Think about what that means in a real situation. If a woman is unsure whether she is pleasing you, she begins to hesitate internally. That hesitation is subtle, but it changes her behavior. She becomes more cautious, less expressive, and less confident in the moment. On the other hand, when you give simple, direct feedback, even a few words, it removes that uncertainty completely. It reassures her that she is on the right path, and that reassurance allows her to relax and become more open, both physically and emotionally. From a biological perspective, this kind of communication triggers dopamine activity, which strengthens motivation and pleasure. But from an emotional standpoint, it builds trust. It tells her that she is not guessing, and that her actions are genuinely contributing to shared satisfaction. That shift alone can transform the entire experience from something uncertain into something confident and flowing. The adjustment is simple. You don't need elaborate language or rehearsed phrases. You just need honest, immediate responses that confirm what feels good and what you enjoy in the moment. Now, let's move into a misconception that often causes more limitation than people realize, and that is the belief that intimacy is primarily about technique. Many men spend years believing that if they learn the right method, the right sequence, or the right approach, they will automatically become exceptional partners. But that assumption overlooks a critical truth. Human arousal, especially for women, is not driven primarily by mechanics. It is heavily influenced by psychological and emotional context. In fact, a large portion of arousal is shaped by how safe, desired, and connected a woman feels in the moment. Even perfect physical technique loses its impact if the emotional environment does not support openness. This is why presence matters so much. Your attention, your eye contact, your responsiveness, and your ability to stay fully engaged in the moment often have more influence than any specific action. When a woman feels emotionally secure and genuinely desired, her body responds differently. There is less tension, more natural responsiveness, and a greater ability to fully experience pleasure without resistance. But when that emotional layer is missing, even technically correct actions can feel disconnected. The takeaway here is not to ignore technique entirely, but to understand that it is only one part of a much larger equation. Next, we come to something many men overlook completely, and that is the absence of clear desire statements. A common assumption is that desire is already understood, that it doesn't need to be verbalized. But in reality, unspoken desire is often less powerful than expressed desire. When you clearly communicate that you want her, not just physically, but personally, it activates a strong psychological response. From a nervous system perspective, hearing direct expressions of desire can shift the body into a more receptive state. It signals acceptance and selection, which reduces internal resistance. Emotionally, it creates a sense of being chosen, not just involved. That difference is subtle, but extremely impactful. It changes how she interprets the entire interaction. Even simple expressions, when said sincerely, can carry significant weight. A direct statement of wanting her in that moment can do more than any complex approach. It removes ambiguity and replaces it with clarity. And clarity is what allows deeper connection to form without hesitation. Now let's address a behavior that often creates confusion rather than connection, and that is overcomplicating communication during intimacy, especially when it comes to verbal expression or what people casually refer to as dirty talk. Many men either avoid it completely or attempt to force language that doesn't feel natural to them. Both extremes reduce effectiveness. The reality is that effective communication in these moments does not rely on scripts or performance. It relies on simplicity and authenticity. When you try to force complex or exaggerated language, it can feel disconnected and artificial, which disrupts the natural flow of the experience. On the other hand, when communication is simple, direct, and aligned with genuine feeling, it enhances connection rather than interrupting it. A useful way to think about it is through progression. Start with appreciation, move into feedback, and allow desire to emerge naturally. There is no need to rush into intensity. Just like seasoning and cooking, the right amount at the right time enhances everything, while too much too soon overwhelms the experience. The goal is not to perform, but to communicate presence and engagement in a way that feels natural for both partners. As we continue, you'll begin to notice a pattern forming across all of these points. It is not about doing more or doing things dramatically differently. It is about small, intentional adjustments that change how you are perceived and how the experience is felt on both sides. And as we move into the final section, that pattern becomes even more important because it ties everything together into one consistent approach. Now we move into the next layer, and this is where the pattern becomes even clearer because it connects everything we've discussed into something much more practical and immediate in real-life intimacy. One of the most overlooked yet powerful elements in this entire subject is what happens after intimacy ends. Many men assume the experience is complete once everything is finished, and they naturally shift their attention elsewhere, sometimes to sleep, sometimes to silence, and sometimes simply to disengagement. But from a biological and emotional standpoint, this moment is far from over for a woman. Right after climax, the body enters a phase where certain neurochemicals, especially oxytocin, become highly active. This is often referred to as the bonding window. During this period, the brain is more sensitive to emotional connection, reassurance, and closeness. What happens in this phase has a lasting effect on how the entire experience is remembered. It is not just about what happened physically before, but how the emotional space is handled afterward. When there is no connection in this moment, when there is silence or immediate separation, the emotional system does not fully integrate the experience in a positive way. Instead, it can feel incomplete or detached, even if everything before it was physically satisfying. But when there is simple, genuine acknowledgement, something changes. A few sincere words, a calm presence, or even a moment of appreciation can reinforce emotional safety and deepen the sense of trust between both partners. From a psychological perspective, this is where long-term attachment is strengthened. It tells her, without needing anything elaborate, that she is valued beyond the physical interaction. That emotional reinforcement is what often determines how memorable the entire experience becomes, not intensity alone. Now, when we step back and look at everything discussed so far, another important truth becomes visible. Most of the issues we've covered are not about lack of effort, they are about lack of alignment. Men are often trying, but the way they are trying does not always match what actually creates connection for the other person involved. That gap is where most dissatisfaction quietly develops. Let's take another step forward and focus on how all of this can be translated into practical behavior. One of the most effective shifts is learning to use your voice consistently throughout intimacy, not in a forced or exaggerated way, but in a natural, present way that reflects what you are genuinely experiencing. A single sentence of appreciation in the right moment can completely change the emotional tone of the interaction. Alongside that, anchoring your physical actions with verbal acknowledgement creates a stronger sense of connection. When you combine touch with awareness, when she can hear that she is affecting you positively, the experience becomes more immersive for both partners. It stops being something silent and mechanical and becomes something shared and responsive. Another key adjustment is slowing down the overall rhythm of interaction, not just physically, but mentally. Instead of focusing on progression or outcomes, the emphasis shifts toward presence. When attention is fully in the moment, rather than on what comes next, the entire experience naturally becomes more connected and responsive. This is often where the difference between routine and meaningful intimacy begins to show itself most clearly. We also see the importance of clarity in communication, especially when it comes to desire. When desire is expressed directly, it removes ambiguity from the interaction. It allows the other person to feel chosen in a clear and unmistakable way. That sense of being chosen has a deep psychological effect because it strengthens emotional openness and reduces internal hesitation. Even the way communication is simplified plays a role here. There is no need for complexity or performance. The most effective expressions are often the simplest ones, delivered at the right time with sincerity. Overthinking language often creates distance, while simplicity creates closeness. That is a consistent pattern across both clinical observation and lived experience. As all of these elements begin to work together, something important becomes noticeable. Intimacy stops being a sequence of isolated actions and starts becoming a continuous emotional experience. Each moment connects to the next, and the overall interaction feels more natural, more grounded, and more meaningful for both people involved. And at this stage, we begin to see why small adjustments often have a much greater impact than people expect. Because what changes the experience is not intensity, but consistency. Not complexity, but awareness. Not performance, but presence. As we move toward the final part, everything will come together into a clearer framework, showing how these principles form a complete approach rather than separate ideas. Now we move into a deeper stage of understanding, where everything we've discussed begins to connect into a more complete picture of how intimacy actually works in practice, not in theory, but in real human interaction. At this point, it becomes important to address a mistake that is extremely common, yet rarely acknowledged openly. Many men believe that if they simply perform the right actions, everything will naturally fall into place. They treat intimacy like a checklist, something that can be optimized step by step through repetition. But human connection does not respond well to mechanical thinking. It responds to awareness, presence, and emotional sensitivity. When behavior becomes routine without emotional engagement, the experience often loses its depth. Even if everything appears correct on the surface, something subtle is missing underneath. That missing element is usually emotional attunement, the ability to notice, respond, and adjust based on how your partner is actually feeling in the moment rather than following a fixed internal script. This is why presence plays such a central role. Presence is not just about being physically there. It is about being mentally and emotionally engaged with what is happening right now without distraction or anticipation of what comes next. When presence is strong, even small actions carry more meaning because they are delivered with awareness rather than habit. Now let's talk about something that often gets misunderstood, and that is the role of verbal expression in desire and intimacy. Some men either avoid it completely or feel uncomfortable expressing what they want directly. Others may attempt it, but in a way that feels forced or disconnected from their natural personality. Both approaches reduce effectiveness, but for different reasons. The key is not intensity of language, but authenticity of expression. When desire is communicated in a simple and sincere way, it creates clarity. It removes guesswork from the interaction and allows both partners to feel more aligned. This clarity reduces hesitation, both emotionally and physically, and helps create a smoother, more connected experience. Another important factor is emotional safety. Many men underestimate how much emotional safety influences physical responsiveness. When a woman feels emotionally secure, when she does not feel judged, rushed, or evaluated, her body naturally becomes more responsive. Tension decreases, and the ability to fully relax into the moment increases. This is not something that can be forced. It is created gradually through consistency, tone, and behavior that signals respect and attentiveness. Small actions like patience, acknowledgement, and genuine responsiveness build this sense of safety over time. And once it is established, the overall experience becomes significantly more fluid and connected. We also need to revisit the idea of feedback because it continues to play an essential role throughout the entire interaction. Feedback is not just about encouragement in isolated moments. It is about maintaining a continuous loop of communication that keeps both partners aligned. Without it, uncertainty grows. With it, confidence increases. When a woman receives clear signals that what she is doing is appreciated, her engagement increases naturally. She becomes more confident, more expressive, and more willing to participate fully in the experience. That confidence is not just emotional, it translates into physical openness as well. On the other side, when a man remains silent or emotionally distant, the interaction becomes harder for her to interpret. That uncertainty can subtly reduce her comfort level, even if everything else appears fine on the surface. This is why communication, even in simple forms, has such a strong influence on overall intimacy. Another element worth highlighting is pacing. Not just physical pacing, but emotional pacing. Rushing through moments or constantly trying to move toward an outcome disrupts the natural flow of connection. It creates pressure where there should be ease. When pressure increases, responsiveness often decreases. But when the pace is allowed to adjust naturally, based on mutual comfort and engagement, the experience becomes more balanced. There is space for anticipation, response, and emotional synchronization. That synchronization is often what makes the interaction feel more meaningful and memorable. As we continue to bring these ideas together, a clear pattern emerges. The most impactful changes are not dramatic shifts in behavior, but subtle refinements in awareness. How you speak, how you listen, how you respond, and how present you remain in each moment all contribute more than any single technique ever could. And as we move into the final section, everything begins to converge into a simple principle that ties all of this together into one clear approach to intimacy. Now we arrive at the final stage, where everything we've discussed comes together into a single, clear understanding of what truly shapes meaningful intimacy between two people. If you look back at all the patterns we've covered, one thing becomes unmistakably clear. The biggest difference between average intimacy and deeply memorable connection is not strength, not technique, and not complexity. It is awareness combined with presence, expressed through small but intentional behaviors that signal emotional engagement at every level. Many men spend years focusing on performance, believing that improvement comes from doing more or doing something different. But in reality, the most powerful shift comes from removing emotional distance. When you are fully present, when your attention is not divided, and when your communication reflects genuine engagement, the entire dynamic changes naturally without force. At its core, intimacy is not just a physical interaction, it is a continuous exchange of emotional signals. Every word, every pause, every response carries meaning. When those signals are clear and consistent, both partners feel more connected, more secure, and more open to the experience unfolding between them. This is why simple communication matters so much. A few honest words at the right time can do more than any elaborate strategy. When a woman feels that she is being seen, not just physically but emotionally, her entire internal state shifts. She becomes more relaxed, more receptive, and more connected to the moment she is sharing with you. Equally important is the way desire is expressed. When desire is direct and sincere, it removes ambiguity. It tells her clearly that she is not just part of an interaction, but the focus of it. That clarity builds emotional confidence, and emotional confidence naturally enhances physical responsiveness. The two are deeply linked, even if it is not always obvious at first glance. Another key principle is consistency. Not perfection, not performance, but consistency in attention, tone, and engagement. When a woman experiences consistency in how she is treated during intimate moments, trust develops. And when trust develops, emotional barriers begin to fall away. That is when intimacy becomes more natural and less effortful for both sides. It is also important to understand that aftercare, or what happens after intimacy, is not an optional detail. It is a continuation of the emotional experience. The period after physical closeness is often when emotional meaning is fully formed. A calm presence, a few sincere words, or even quiet connection can significantly influence how the entire experience is remembered. When that moment is ignored, the experience can feel incomplete, even if everything before it was physically satisfying. But when it is acknowledged with care and attention, it reinforces emotional safety and strengthens the bond between partners in a way that lasts beyond the moment itself. As we bring everything together, the framework becomes very simple. Speak with honesty, act with awareness, respond with presence. Slow down your attention. Express desire clearly. Give feedback naturally. And most importantly, remain emotionally engaged from beginning to end, not just physically involved. These are not complicated instructions, but they require intention. They require you to step out of autopilot and into awareness. And once you do, the change is not just in your performance, but in the entire quality of connection you create. If there is one final truth to take away from all of this, it is that intimacy is not something you master through control. It is something you improve through understanding. The more you understand your partner's emotional and physical responses, the more naturally everything else begins to align. So as you move forward, do not focus on perfection. Focus on presence. Do not chase complexity. Focus on clarity. And do not treat intimacy as a task. Treat it as a shared experience that is shaped moment by moment through attention, respect, and genuine connection. If you apply even a small part of what you've learned here, you will begin to notice a shift, not just in how things feel physically, but in how deeply connected both of you become over time. And that is ultimately what lasting intimacy is built on. And with that, this journey comes to a close.